It is a pleasure still to introduce you to Rosalind Watts. She's going to talk about patient reports of increased connection to self, others, and world after psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Dr. Rosalind Watts completed her clinical training, psychology training, in London. After 6 years of practicing psychotherapy, she joined the Imperial College Psilocybin for Depression study as a therapist guide. Roz believes that psychedelic treatments can have an important role in changing the way we conceptualize and treat mental health difficulties. Her research includes qualitative analysis of the therapeutic impact of psilocybin and LSD, which has informed her interest in connection to self, others, and world as a mechanism of change. She's currently working alongside Dr. Robert Carhart Harris and Professor David Nutt and Dr. David Erritzoe, planning the upcoming Imperial Psilocybin for Depression trial. Roz?
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the Psilocybin for Depression study. My colleagues have already presented the main study findings, and I'm going to be focusing on the qualitative follow-up interviews. So just briefly, the Psilocybin for Depression study, there were 20 participants with treatment-resistant depression. They had had depression for an average 18 years. They had tried between 3 and 11 types of antidepressant medication and had up to 6 courses of talking therapy, and none of which had helped them. And then they participated in our study. They had a 10 milligram and then a week later a 25 milligram dose of psilocybin in a supportive setting. And the results were very impressive. It's just a small group, 20 participants, but exceptionally large effect sizes. And thinking in terms of people rather than effect sizes, we found that at the 6-month point, 6 of the patients were in remission, and 3 of the participants didn't have any response to the psilocybin in the session, and they didn't show any decrease in their depression symptoms after either. But then the remaining 11 showed this pattern of a reduction in symptoms of depression for about 6 to 12 weeks, and then the symptoms of depression started to return. So I interviewed everybody 6 months after their psilocybin session. I used a semi-structured interview asking about their experiences of depression, their experiences of the psilocybin session, what had happened in the session. I asked them how things had been in the 6 months after the session, what had changed, if anything. And I also asked them to compare psilocybin treatment to the previous treatments they'd tried. I used thematic analysis to analyze the data, and the main theme I found was that participants described going from disconnection to connection. Now, it's so fascinating because when I started this project, I hadn't ever really thought about connectedness. It certainly wasn't something that I was taught in my clinical psychology training, and it's not something I'd even discussed with my psychedelic research colleagues. It seemed like kind of a new thing, even though, of course, it's a central theme in the original psychedelic movement. I hadn't really thought about it that much. And it's been amazing at this conference because in so many different talks, it's just been popping up and popping up. I don't know if other people have noticed it, but there's just been so much connection, and it just feels very exciting. Like Stan Groff, Franz Vollenweider, just now Gabby was talking about it, and of course Mary, and it's just been, it's very exciting. I think we're on to something. So, I've defined connection, although it could be defined in many different ways, but for me and for the participants in our study, it was an intellectual, empathic, and embodied closeness to self, others, and the world. And they talked about their depression as disconnection. So, disconnection from the world, disconnection from others, disconnection from the self, so disconnected from a sense of purpose or an identity, and disconnection from the senses, not to be able to appreciate the taste of good food or music or beauty. And they describe being trapped in their minds, something that Gabby also mentioned in her study, this sense of being just trapped with repetitive negative thinking all the time. And there were 2 main types of analogy that our participants used to describe this feeling of being trapped in their mind. One of them was of a mental prison. Someone described it as like a sack over the head. And the other one was of a computer that had got locked, so a computer that had short-circuited. So their worlds had got smaller. They described being trapped with this kind of rumination going around, and that really made it very difficult to engage in anything. And then they had their session, and this image, which Gabby also used, and it's what happens on the brain when the brain is on psilocybin. So this hyper-connection that we're so used to seeing. So they had the session, and then they described being more connected in their lives. That image of the connected brain is a great analogy for the way their lives changed afterwards. They connected to themselves, to others, and the world around them. So first of all, this theme of connection to self. So you can see on the right the number of people that identified the theme. And this is really out of 17, because as I said before, 3 of the patients didn't actually respond to the treatment, so it wasn't effective for them. So 14 of the 17 patients for whom it was effective all described this sense of having a connected mind. And then you can see the other sub-themes too. So I'll go through them all. So a connected mind. They used terminology like a reboot, a reset. My mind was reconfigured. So I'll give quotes, and where I give quotes, the first one will be about the short-term benefits, so what happened in the session and straight away afterwards. And the second quote will be about the long-term benefits. So here we go with one participant who said, this is talking about his session. It was like when you defrag the hard drive on your computer. I experienced blocks going into place, things being rearranged in my mind. I visualized it as it was all put into order, a beautiful experience with these gold blocks going into black drawers that would illuminate. And I thought, my brain is being defragged. How brilliant is that? And then talking about how that process continued over the months after the session, he said, my mind works differently now. I ruminate much less and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. But now my thoughts feel like they make sense with context and logical flow. And then connection to senses. Many people describe being able to taste things, see things they hadn't noticed before. This participant described things seeing very bright and colorful afterwards. And then the long-term benefit. One of the women participants described that she lived in this flat across the road from a park in central London, and she'd never really noticed the park or gone to the park. And afterwards, for months, she would look at the park across the road and say that it was just so green, a type of green I'd never experienced before. And she said that things still look different to her even 6 months later. Connection to emotions. There are so many quotes I would have loved to share with you, but restricting myself just to one. So often people would connect to early memories from early childhood, and feel all the emotions that they would have felt at the time. So I became myself at age 7 after my grandfather had died. I totally was back there, so vivid, so real. I had the emotions that I would have felt at the time, fearful. Why did this happen? The naivety, the shock. And there were many examples of this, sometimes people going back to experiences of childhood abuse and being able to go through that and process that emotion in a way that felt very cathartic for them. And many of them described that in the months afterwards, they felt that their emotional repertoire had been expanded. They were more able to feel a range of emotions. In depression, they had been stuck in this consistent sadness or apathy and not able to feel this range of emotions. But in the months afterwards, they were able to accept a whole range: agony, boredom, loneliness, and also appreciation of the wonderful times. And then connection to the body. So this connection to somatic experience in the session, it helped me realize why I felt the pain in my chest. I saw it visually and felt it emotionally. Then I felt so much lighter, like something had been released. And for many of them, this connection to the body, connection to somatic experience, helped them understand the way their body worked. And it gave them a new respect for their body. And they wanted to look after their bodies. Some of them changed their diet. So losing a lot of weight because I didn't want to eat badly. I couldn't eat what I knew wasn't good for me. This sense of really deep knowing and understanding. And then connection to identity. There's a few sub-themes here. So self-worth and self-love, and also a new perspective on the self. Sometimes people had these kind of insights, these moments of insights about themselves and the way they did things and the way they should do things. And sometimes it appeared to people as a kind of outer figure, either a voice or a person giving them lessons. So this woman described an ancient being that she heard. She was so eloquent. She kept calling me my darling. Life is to be lived, my darling. She talked to me in such a loving way, all these things to say about my life. And in the months afterwards, many of them started new activities that were meaningful for them, or they reconnected with old hobbies that they'd stopped for many years. And some also described this ongoing sense of being connected to an inner therapist, this connection to an understanding of the self that lasted and lasted. One person said it was like ingesting his own psychotherapist. So then the next group of themes, connection to others. So connection to partners, friends and family, strangers, and then all humanity. So you can see this kind of like connection going outward. It's this expanding connection. Now, only 5 of them identified this theme of connection to partners, and that was because actually only 5 people in the study had partners. They described being able to engage with their partner for the first time in a long while, so being able to go for dinner. This participant said that he went for dinner with his wife the day after the psilocybin session for the first time in 6 years. And for many of them, this connection to each other lasted. They found it easier to talk openly. Connection to family and friends. So one participant who had suffered from abuse from his mother, and in the session, it was a very intense session, and he had this experience of understanding and compassion for her and where she was coming from, which is an incredible, incredible thing. He said, I realized that my mother was out on a ledge. She too was completely unconnected, disconnected. I felt some compassion for her, a different perspective, that it wasn't an all-powerful world and universe against me. She too was out on a ledge. And many people described having this insight and understanding about people in their lives. And this often translated into behavior. So, for example, driving across the country to see friends and family again. And connecting to strangers, people described that their interactions with the person on the bus, the person in the shop, changed. Rather than seeing strangers as inherently threatening, they became imbued with this positive feeling of wanting to talk to them. I would look at people on the street and think, how interesting we are. I felt connected to them all. One of the participants walked past a bike shop. He was quite interested in bikes, and he saw that the shop was badly organized. And he said to the guy running the shop that he would like to help him, and he went unpaid for 6 months to help the guy renovate his shop, which was amazing. And four of the participants described, in the sessions, they described having either insights or visions or just thoughts about the plight of refugees. It was in the news a lot at the time. And this connection to all humanity was quite a common theme. This connection, it's just a lovely feeling, this sense of connectedness. We are all connected. It's like a miracle. And of course, in the psychedelic research community, this is something we know about, but for the participants, it was a miracle. It was this completely new feeling. And it lasted, this sense of we're all in the same boat, and that made them feel reassured. And then connection to the world. So many of them described a sense of getting a wider perspective, being able to go from that kind of trapped mind and be able to engage with the world around them. One woman who hadn't worked for a long time went for a job interview, and she got the job, and she's still thriving in the job. She said, describing the interview, in the interview, this voice just came out. It sounded like someone else. I was talking. The sound of her own confident voice was something that she hadn't heard for a long time. Connection to nature. Feeling part of nature. So before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like a TV or a painting. You are a part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. And a connection to a spiritual principle. In the session and afterwards, one participant described this experience of rapture and connection to the divine, and he took away this message that there was something divine within him, which really lasted. So we see this process of expansion, and here are 2 beautiful quotes to describe this. During the session, I was everybody, unity, one life with 6 billion faces. I was the one asking for love and giving love. I was swimming in the sea, and the sea was me. And you can see how poetic these quotes are, and the whole interview transcripts were, for many of them, really rich in imagery. Like Google Earth, I had zoomed out. For weeks afterwards, I was absolutely connected to myself, to every living thing, to the universe, which makes me think again of this image, being absolutely connected to everything. So we see this process of expansion and connection to the self, to others, and the world. But I don't want to suggest that it was just 1 or 2 sessions and then it was all rainbows, because people's symptoms of depression did come back. After 6 to 12 weeks, the symptoms of depression came back. But they also described that they still felt more connected. They could feel low, they could feel tired, but they still felt connected. There was more meaning. They felt connected to the world around them. And then they talked about their previous treatments, and it was very unexpected to see that the previous treatments they'd had actually made their disconnection worse. 18 of them described that antidepressants had made them feel more disconnected, and 11 described that talking therapy had made them feel more disconnected. So they'd tried on average the sample had tried between 3 and 11 different types of antidepressants, and none of them had worked for them. And one of the reasons why they described antidepressant medication as being unhelpful was that it disconnected them from their emotions. So one of the symptoms or kind of side effects of antidepressant medication can be emotional blunting. So it can take the peaks and troughs off experience. So people might be protected from the worst of the pain, but they also don't feel the good times either. I was a zombie. I felt a bit like a machine. I was sedated. I didn't care about anything. And one of the other things they described about this feeling of being disconnected from their emotions was that it prevented them from having the opportunity to confront their pain and be transformed by it. So when I was talking to people, it was 6 months after their psilocybin experience, and they'd had the opportunity, a very new experience for them, to really confront their pain in a supported way and be transformed by it. So it's Bill Richards' lovely analogy of what a psilocybin session can do. It's going down into the basement and taking your flashlight and shining it around all of the scary corners and the monsters and learning from them. And it's a process of the unfolding self, of individuation, of integrating the shadow parts. And although painful and scary, it can be incredibly transformative. And patients in our study described that when they'd been taking antidepressant medication, it had done the opposite. It was almost like it was shutting that door to the basement. It was preventing them from exploring those things. Medications just suppress. It never feels like it's making a change. It's like taking a painkiller for a toothache. You don't get to the source of the problem. And that makes me think about the story that Stan Groff shared. He talked about these treatments that just work on the symptom level. And it's like a car that's run out of oil, and there's the red warning light flashing. And so you take the car into the garage, and the mechanic, rather than fixing the engine and putting more oil in, just removes the warning light. And it was like, this is what they described with the antidepressant medication. It was just removing the warning light. And talking therapy as well had, for many of them, had exacerbated their disconnection. So they'd had up to 6 courses of talking therapy, and it was always brief, so they'd be offered 5 to 8 sessions of talking therapy. And one of them had been offered 6 courses of this short-term therapy. So for him, he'd had 48 sessions. That's a year's worth of therapy, but broken up into 6 chunks, 6 little chunks of hello and goodbye with 6 different people, which was anti-therapeutic for him. He said, "I'm sick to the back teeth of telling people again and again the backstory, all the talking therapies. Each time you go for an 8 or 6 week course of that stuff, you spend the first few weeks going over the stuff. They ask all the questions again. Then it's session 4. And then you think, who's learning something here? Because I'm not, you are." And many of them also explained that the therapy they'd been offered was very directive. It was often manualized. And they had the sense that, well, at best, they had a sense that the idea and the motivation was all coming from the therapist. It was coming from an external source. And so it was difficult for them to really feel motivated. And at worst, it felt condescending. They felt like they were being squeezed into boxes, and it just did not help them. They all seemed to be trying to fit a person into a preconceived set of patterns. Try to do this, make this your goal, and we'll measure it. But just having these goals set for you is more pressure. And when you don't meet these goals, you feel even worse because you're letting them down, and you already feel let down yourself. And the third category of experience of this talking therapy making disconnection worse was that these short-term treatments weren't able to address trauma. So everybody in the sample had experienced trauma in their life, and that's what they wanted to talk about. But they would go to these sessions, and there would be a kind of manualized sequence of events for these 6 sessions, and so they would never really have the chance to go where they wanted to go. So one described that the first time he had disclosed sexual abuse to a health professional, I got up the courage to tell him. I'd never told anyone, and he just looked at his shoes. And so therapy is meant to be about these moments of connection, but the participants in our sample described these moments of disconnection that they really held on to, they remembered them, and carried them with them. But just to say, actually, that one of the things they appreciated about the psilocybin therapy that they'd had, the psilocybin treatment that they had, was that the team didn't try and direct them in any way. There was no sense of, like, this is what you should be doing, or this is what your goal should be. There was no preconceived patterns, preconceived goals, and there was no shying away from pain. It was a combination of this willingness to just go with them wherever they needed to go, and this trust that it would be the right place, and this support and willingness to confront the painful times that was quite revolutionary for them, very different to what they'd experienced before in their previous treatments. So I guess in summary, it seems to me that the psilocybin treatment was working in a different way, and it was very different to the antidepressant medication and the short-term therapies that they'd had. And it seems that it's working by increasing connection. So, as I said before, connection has been discussed in many of the different lectures, and I think maybe it is a fundamental change process. So, it does make sense that connectedness would be a fundamental change process. If you look at the research on connectedness, most of which is on social connectedness, connection to others, we can see that people that live in connected communities are healthier than people that live in a more isolated way. And we can see that strong social connection has been associated with longevity, a better immune system, recovering from disease faster, better self-esteem, being more empathic to others, being more trusting and being more cooperative. And research has shown that low social connectedness predicts vulnerability to disease and is declined with a higher propensity for antisocial behavior. And there's something called the General Social Survey in the US, which asks people about how many confidants they have, how many people they feel able to share their a personal problem with. And in 1985, of Americans, the modal number of close confidants was only 3. And then in 2004, it dropped to 1, with 25% of Americans saying that they had no one to confide in. So people talk about an epidemic of depression, but maybe it's really an epidemic of disconnection. And not just disconnection from others, but from ourselves and from nature. But the good news is that psilocybin seems to have this very powerful and rapid impact on connection. And that the impact on connection is actually different to the impact on symptoms, because the participants in our study found that even after the symptoms of depression had come back, this connection, this sense of meaning remained. We couldn't quantify this because we didn't have a measure of connection, but we did think that psilocybin was making a change at a deeper level than symptomatology. And this makes sense too. At this early stage in psychedelic research, it does look like psychedelic treatment can have a beneficial impact on so many different conditions. So anxiety, depression, and OCD, smoking cessation, end-of-life anxiety. And it may be that psychedelics are having an impact on certain fundamental processes that underlie many psychiatric conditions. And maybe disconnection can look like depression or addiction, depending on an individual's life circumstances. There's already some work linking addiction to disconnection. And this would have big implications if disconnection to connection is really the fundamental mechanism of change, because maybe it would change the way we think about mental illness. Maybe we'll come to understand human suffering in a new way. Because for all the efforts to develop psychiatric treatments, you still have more chance of recovering from some severe mental health problems in third world countries, where you won't be offered short-term talking therapies or SSRIs, but you will be connected to a community and to nature and to an identity. So the only way to find out if connection is a fundamental mechanism of change is to measure it. And if anybody would like to include a measure, we've developed one, and we would be very happy to share it with anybody. So there's my email address, and if you're doing some research and you'd like to measure connection, I would love to see your data and for us all to connect on this issue of connection. So please do get in touch. And thank you very much. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
For some questions and answers? Come on, step right up. What's your first name, please?
My name is Eduardo Schemberg. Congratulations, Ross. Beautiful way of articulating an important issue. I would just like to ask, is this a new way of understanding mental illness or an ancient one?
Yes, I mean, I think this move back to connectedness is going back to a very, very old way of thinking about things, and it is, yeah, we're connecting with our heritage, we're connecting with the first wave of psychedelic research. So, yeah, there's nothing very new about it. I like that idea that we're going back to an old way of doing things because I think there's a lot of value in it.
Do we have other questions? No questions for us? Then we're going to take about a 5-minute